Maple Hollow was the kind of town people passed through, not the kind they visited. Tucked between endless stretches of pine forest and rusted railroad tracks, it was a place suspended in time, where the loudest sounds were the church bells on Sundays and the creaking of the school gate in the wind. Everyone knew everyone else, and nothing truly unexpected ever happened. That's why, on the gray morning of October 14th, the sight of police cars parked behind the old Maple Hollow Elementary sent quiet ripples through the town like a dropped stone in still water. It started innocently, as these stories often do. A group of local children, chasing a stray dog through the tall weeds behind the abandoned school, tripped over something buried in the dirt. At first, they thought it was just a broken toy. But as they brushed away the soil with their small hands, a pale, porcelain face stared back at them, cracked, weathered, its glass eyes clouded with dirt. They screamed. By the time the adults arrived, the children were already running home in tears, whispering that they had woken up the little girls in the ground. Officer Helen Graves was among the first responders to arrive at the scene. To her, the old school was nothing more than a decaying structure, its windows boarded, the playground rusted into silence. Yet when she crouched down where the children had been digging, something inside her tightened. Just beneath the surface of the soil was a row of small, pale shapes. As the team began carefully uncovering the dirt, the impossible came into view, not one, not two, but dozens of identical porcelain dolls, all buried in a perfect straight line stretching nearly 20 meters long. Each doll was dressed in the same faded blue uniform, the kind students once wore here decades ago. Their eyes, those glass, unblinking eyes, faced east, toward the rising sun. Even stranger, every doll's porcelain hand was folded neatly over its chest, as if posed with care. The air was heavy, the kind of stillness that feels alive, watching. The townspeople gathered beyond the yellow tape, murmuring in disbelief. Some claimed it was a cruel prank, others whispered it was the children coming back. The older residents remembered the stories, the ones never spoken above a whisper, about why the school had been shut down in 1979. They said there was a tragedy, though no one ever agreed on what had truly happened. The records were missing, the teachers moved away, and the building was left to rot, standing like a tombstone for something everyone preferred to forget. By the time the local coroner and crime scene unit arrived, the count had reached 43. 43 identical dolls, each spaced exactly 1 foot apart, each facing the same direction. As night fell, their white faces seemed to glow faintly under the harsh beam of floodlights, casting long shadows across the dirt. It didn't look like a prank. It looked like a ritual. Officer Graves took notes quietly as the last doll was lifted out of the earth. Her hands trembled slightly, though she couldn't explain why. The dolls' faces were eerily lifelike, as if molded after someone real, small differences in expression, subtle imperfections, lips parted just slightly, as if caught mid-sentence. On a hunch, she turned one over, brushing away the last of the soil, and noticed something faintly etched into its porcelain chest. A single word. A name. Evelyn. The sound of her voice saying it seemed to echo in the empty field. None of the other dolls bore visible markings, but now everyone was looking closer, afraid to find more names beneath the grime. The air grew colder. Even the officers spoke in hushed tones, as if disturbing a graveyard. As the scene was secured and the evidence logged, Officer Graves couldn't shake the feeling that the ground itself was holding its breath. The town had always been quiet, but now, that silence felt wrong. Intentional. Watching. And as the first reports went out, the headlines were simple, almost. Absurd, authorities find 43 identical dolls buried behind local school. But for those who stood there that night, for those who saw the empty sockets where eyes should have been, it was clear, this wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. By morning, the story had already spread across the town like wildfire. Every conversation, every diner booth, every radio broadcast in Maple Hollow circled back to one thing, the dolls. Some people said they'd been placed there recently, part of some strange art project or ritual. Others whispered that they'd been buried decades ago, waiting for someone to find them. But no one could explain the precision. 43 identical dolls, arranged perfectly in a line, facing east. It didn't feel random, it felt deliberate. Officer Helen Graves returned to the site at dawn, her boots sinking into the soft, churned earth. The area had been secured overnight, with evidence markers dotting the ground like gravestones. The dolls had been carefully placed on individual tables under a white forensic tent. Even in daylight, they looked unsettling, their porcelain skin gleamed under the pale sun, and their glass eyes reflected it like mirrors. Each doll had a small tag tied to its wrist, now catalogued and photographed. The tags weren't recent. They were yellowed, brittle, ink faded by time. But one thing was unmistakable, each tag carried a date. And those dates weren't the same. As Graves leaned closer, she realized they spanned over decades, from 1935 to 1979. 43 different years, 43 different lives. Her stomach turned. There was no record of who had buried them, and no footprints had been found other than those of the children and officers. The burial trench itself looked old, compacted soil, root systems growing through parts of it. This wasn't something done recently. The mayor arrived later that morning, his face pale and drawn. Reporters were already beginning to circle. "Keep this quiet for now," he instructed, his voice low but urgent. "Last thing we need is hysteria." But hysteria had already begun. Local residents gathered behind the police line, holding on to each other, muttering the same story that had haunted the town for years, the one about the school's last day in 1979. Back then, Maple Hollow Elementary had abruptly shut down. The official story said it was due to structural issues. But everyone remembered the truth: one of the students, a girl named Evelyn Harper, had vanished. No body, no trace. After that, parents refused to send their children back. Within weeks, the school closed for good. The building had stood empty ever since, its windows broken, its hallways filled with graffiti and mold. As the forensic team continued their analysis, one officer called out to Graves. He had found something beneath one of the dolls, a scrap of fabric. It was a piece of faded uniform, the same dull blue as the dolls' dresses, with a stitched patch barely clinging to it. Graves brushed away the dirt and saw the emblem, Maple Hollow Elementary School. The dolls weren't just decorative, they were replicas. Replicas of real children. That realization hit her harder than she expected. She'd seen strange things in her career, abandoned basements filled with bizarre collections, homemade shrines, but there was something different about this. Something almost mournful. Whoever had done this hadn't just buried toys, they'd memorialized something, or someone. Inside the school, a small team began clearing debris, searching for clues. The air was thick with dust and the faint smell of decay. Old desks and chalkboards were still there, coated in grime. On one wall, a faded class photo hung crooked, glass shattered but faces still visible. Graves lifted it gently, brushing off the surface. There were 44 children in the picture. One row of smiling faces, one missing name beneath. The teacher's nameplate was clear: Principal Warren Elridge, 1979. She recognized one face immediately, a little girl with pale eyes and a nervous half-smile. The name below it read Evelyn Harper. Something about her expression pulled at Graves' memory, a haunting familiarity she couldn't place. She tucked the photo into an evidence folder and turned back toward the exit, but paused. There, near the doorframe, carved faintly into the wood, was a name. Not written, but scratched, as if by a small, desperate hand. It was the same name she had seen on the doll the night before. Evelyn. That single word sent a chill down her spine. She turned to one of the officers. "Get me the records," she said. "School files, student lists, everything we can find from 1979. By afternoon, she was back at the station, going through stacks of old documents. Most of the records were incomplete, eaten away by time and neglect. But one thing stood out: the student roster ended abruptly on October 23, 1979. A single note was scrawled across the last page: school terminated. Incident under review. No further details. No closure. As night fell, Graves sat alone at her desk, the doll's photographs spread out before her. 43 porcelain faces staring blankly back, identical but somehow unique in expression: sorrow, fear, silence. Each one felt like a frozen scream. And yet, she couldn't shake the question: if there were 43 dolls, why did the class photo show 44 children? The thought hung in her mind as the clock ticked past midnight. Outside, the town slept in uneasy quiet. Inside, Officer Graves stared at the photograph, her eyes drawn again and again to that one name. Evelyn Harper. The girl who disappeared the same year the school died. And now, decades later, she seemed to have returned, not in body, but in porcelain. The next morning, the investigation took a darker, more personal turn. Officer Helen Graves sat in the dimly lit records room of the Maple Hollow Police Department, surrounded by stacks of old files that smelled of mildew and dust. Most of the papers were so brittle they flaked at her touch. The documents from 1979 were fragmented, whole pages missing, ink faded to ghosts. But one name kept surfacing in the fragile archives like a whisper breaking through static: Evelyn Harper. Evelyn had been 10 years old when she disappeared. A quiet, reserved girl who rarely smiled in photographs and always seemed to be standing slightly apart from the rest of her class. The reports described her as imaginative, isolated, and prone to speaking to herself. Teachers dismissed it as harmless childhood behavior. Her father, a local carpenter named Thomas Harper, had told the police that Evelyn spent most of her time carving little figurines out of leftover wood. He called them her companions. No one thought much of it, until she vanished without a trace. According to the missing persons file, Evelyn was last seen walking home from school on a cold October afternoon in 1979. The witness statements were inconsistent. Some said she was with friends. Others said she was alone. Her father reported her missing that evening, claiming she'd been unusually quiet that morning, refusing breakfast and mumbling something about them not wanting to leave. The police searched the woods, the creeks, even the old mine shafts near town, but they found nothing. No body. No footprints. Just a single doll's head lying in the mud near the school's back fence. When the school abruptly shut down 2 weeks later, everyone assumed the two events were connected. But without proof, the case went cold. And so did the town's memory of it. Over the years, Evelyn became less of a person and more of a story, an urban ghost, whispered about at sleepovers and campfires. The girl who talked to dolls. The child who never left. Her name faded from official records but lived on in rumor. Graves stared at the case photo of Evelyn, a black and white image from her school file. The girl's pale face seemed almost translucent, her eyes wide and uncertain. There was a faint outline of something in her hands, like a small object she was clutching tightly, though the image was too grainy to tell what it was. For a moment, Graves felt the strange, inexplicable sense that the girl was looking back at her, silently asking to be remembered. Later that afternoon, Graves met with one of the few surviving staff members from the old school, Mrs. Margaret Lorne, now in her 80s, living in a nursing home on the outskirts of town. Her memory was frail, but when Graves mentioned Evelyn Harper's name, something in the old woman's eyes changed. "Oh, that poor child," Mrs. Lorne whispered, voice trembling. She was different. Always drawing faces. Always talking to her friends. The other children teased her for it. She said they didn't understand. She said the dolls were lonely. Graves leaned forward. Did she ever say anything else about them? Anything unusual? Mrs. Lorne hesitated, then nodded slowly. She said they could feel pain. And that when they cried, no one could hear them but her. A shiver ran down Graves' spine. She tried to keep her voice steady. Did the principal know about this? Mrs. Lorne's expression hardened. He knew everything. But he didn't like it when the children talked about Evelyn. He said it frightened the younger ones. After she disappeared, he made us stop mentioning her name. Told us she never existed. That's when things started to change. What things? Graves asked. The old woman's eyes drifted toward the window. At night, we'd hear music. Like a lullaby coming from the empty classroom. Sometimes we'd find dolls sitting on the desks in the morning, ones we hadn't seen before. Perfectly clean, perfectly new. He said it was vandals. But no one ever caught them. Graves' recorder picked up the soft tremor in Mrs. Lorne's breathing. Do you believe the dolls were connected to Evelyn? I don't just believe it, she whispered, voice barely audible. I know it. She made them. Every single one. Graves frowned. But she was only 10 years old. That's impossible. Mrs. Lorne's hands gripped the edge of her blanket. You don't understand, dear. Evelyn wasn't like other children. She said she could make people stay. Even when they wanted to leave. The room fell silent. Outside, rain began tapping against the window, slow and rhythmic, like someone knocking from the other side of the glass. Back at the station, Graves couldn't shake the words from her head, she could make people stay. She reopened the photographs of the dolls. Each one had subtle differences, small scratches, faint brush strokes around the lips, the way the fingers curled slightly inward. They weren't identical mass-produced figures. They were handmade. Individually crafted. And then something else caught her attention. On the bottom of each doll's foot was a small marking, a series of numbers etched into the porcelain. Graves magnified one of the photos and read the digits carefully. They weren't serial codes or dates. They were birth years. Each one matching the age of a student who attended the school in 1979. As the realization set in, Graves leaned back in her chair, her pulse quickening. 43 dolls. 43 students. One missing. But if Evelyn Harper disappeared in 1979, and the dolls bore the years of her classmates, then who had buried them? Before she could dwell on the thought, her phone buzzed. It was the forensic team. They had found something new buried deeper in the soil near where the last doll was uncovered. Something small, metallic, and engraved. When Graves arrived at the site an hour later, the object was already on the evidence table. A tiny brass locket, caked in dirt but still intact. She opened it carefully. Inside was a miniature portrait, faded but recognizable. A young girl with pale eyes and a nervous half-smile. Evelyn Harper. And just beneath her image, scratched into the metal, was a line of text written in trembling handwriting, "They won't forget us this time." By the third day of the investigation, Officer Helen Graves felt the case slipping from police procedure into something far darker. The dolls, the tags, the locket, they weren't random discoveries. They were fragments of a story someone had gone to great lengths to bury. Graves knew the only way to understand was to return to the place where it all began, the old school. The building had been cordoned off since the dolls were found, but Graves arranged a special permit to enter. She stepped through the rotting doorway, her boots crunching on broken glass. The air inside was thick with dust and mildew. The smell of damp wood and decayed paper hung in every corner. Light from her flashlight danced over peeling paint and crumbling plaster. Every step echoed in the empty hallways like the slow beat of a drum. Graves headed toward the principal's office, located at the far end of the building. The room was smaller than she imagined, filled with stacks of rotting binders, yellowed newspaper clippings, and filing cabinets that had not been opened in decades. The desk was still there, its surface warped by years of neglect, drawers half open as though someone had fled in haste. It was behind the largest cabinet that Graves found it, a locked steel box tucked away in the corner. The lock was rusted, but with a few careful turns of her tools, she forced it open. Inside were file folders so brittle that they crumbled at her touch. Each folder contained reports, handwritten notes, and typewritten pages. Graves sorted through them slowly, as though handling evidence from another world. The files weren't just student records. They were psychological evaluations, a log of 43 children, each labeled with the term non-compliant. Some reports were short, noting behaviors like withdrawn, repetitive speech, or imaginary companions. Others were detailed, describing entire sessions of observation. Every single file ended abruptly, dated just days before the school closed. Each one bore a single ominous note stamped in red ink, reassigned to Special Room B. Graves stopped cold when she saw Evelyn Harper's file. The folder was thicker than the others, filled with layered reports, sketches, and even fragments of diary entries. Her handwriting, delicate and uneven, filled the margins. Some entries spoke of dolls, dozens of them, and how they stood guard for her friends. Others were more cryptic: they listen when others do not. They will never leave. What unsettled Graves most was the final page of Evelyn's file. It wasn't an official report but a single sheet of paper torn from a notebook, covered in small, messy handwriting. Room B is not a place. Room B is a promise. We will not forget. That sentence made her uneasy. She had heard something like it before, the word scratched inside the locket. Her eyes scanned the other files. Every one ended with the same phrase. Room B. No explanation. No record of what Room B was. It was as though it existed outside official memory. Graves dug deeper. Inside another folder, she found a hand-drawn map of the school dated 1978. It was crude but detailed. Classrooms were labeled clearly, except one area marked simply as Room B. It was drawn in a section of the basement that, according to official building plans, didn't exist. Graves compared it to the blueprints the town archives had provided, no mention of Room B anywhere. She traced the lines with her finger, her mind racing. Whoever made this map had insider access. Someone with intimate knowledge of the school's hidden architecture. That person could still be alive. And still holding secrets. There was more. Beneath the map was a folder labeled Restricted, Principal's Personal Notes. Inside, in the principal's handwriting, was a series of entries spanning several years. One entry in particular stood out, dated a week before the school closed. They are ready. Room B is prepared. Evelyn understands. She will keep them safe. Graves felt her breath catch. Who were they? What was Room B? And why was Evelyn Harper the one chosen to keep them safe? The noise of her own breathing seemed too loud in the hollow office. Somewhere, far above her, a floorboard creaked. Graves spun around, shining her flashlight across the empty room. There was nothing there. Yet the air felt heavier. Almost alive. Before leaving, she took one last look inside the principal's desk drawer. There, under a stack of student files, she found a small bundle tied with twine. Inside were porcelain fragments, shards shaped like tiny hands and feet, the same as those buried behind the school. They were broken but unmistakably part of the same dolls. Clutched in the bundle was a scrap of paper with a single word written in fading ink: remember. Graves closed the drawer slowly, her mind full of questions. She walked back out of the principal's office into the hallway, the sound of her footsteps swallowed by silence. Somewhere deep within the old walls, it felt as though something was waiting. And Helen Graves knew she had just scratched the surface of a truth far darker than she had ever imagined. The discovery of the principal's secret files changed everything for Officer Helen Graves. Every layer of the investigation now pointed toward one question: what was Room B? It wasn't on any official blueprint. No building permit, no maintenance records, no mention in the archives. According to every record, Room B was supposed to be nothing but a fabrication. Yet the files, the map, Evelyn Harper's notes, they all insisted it existed. Graves returned to the school with a small team equipped with ground-penetrating radar. The equipment hummed quietly as they swept the ground behind the building. The children's playground, overgrown now with weeds and littered with rusted swings, was silent except for the occasional beep of the scanner. At first, there was nothing. But after several minutes, the device registered an anomaly, a hollow space directly beneath the back playground, stretching beneath what had once been the area of the old swing set. The discovery sent a ripple of unease through the team. Graves stood over the readings, her breath clouding in the cold air. "It's an enclosed chamber," she said quietly. "Something was built down there." The technicians confirmed the finding. The hollow was large enough to be a room, possibly more than one. But according to every known record, the basement ended long before that point. By the following morning, the excavation began. Local news crews arrived, their cameras capturing every shovelful of dirt removed from the school's shadowed backyard. Crowds gathered behind police barriers. Parents of former students whispered to each other, their faces pale, as if afraid of what might be uncovered. The town that had long tried to bury its own past was now forced to stare at it. Graves stayed at the site all day, watching as layers of soil and roots were stripped away. Her thoughts drifted back to Evelyn Harper's words, "Room B is a promise." What did that mean? Graves shivered. Every instinct told her Room B was not a physical place alone. It was something else, a name for a secret, a space in which the unimaginable had been hidden. By late afternoon, the excavation team struck concrete. They carefully began removing debris to reveal an entrance, small and sealed. It looked unnatural, as if deliberately concealed. The surface was cracked and brittle, but beneath it was wood, the faint smell of rot still clinging to it. Someone had buried this door for a reason. When they finally opened it, a rush of cold air escaped the chamber below. Graves shone her flashlight into the darkness. The beam revealed something she couldn't have prepared for, a narrow stairwell descending into pitch black. The air was damp and heavy, carrying with it a strange, sweet scent, like something decayed, but preserved. The team descended slowly. Graves followed, flashlight cutting through the darkness. As they reached the bottom, the beam illuminated a small room, filled with objects arranged in silence. Child-sized desks lined the walls, each in perfect order. The air was thick with dust, but the desks looked untouched. On each desk sat a porcelain doll, identical to those buried behind the school, their glass eyes staring forward without blinking. 43 dolls. 43 desks. 43 identical children frozen in time. The sight was so disturbing that several officers stepped back in silence. Graves felt her chest tighten. It wasn't a room. It was a shrine. A place of remembrance. Or something more sinister. They began documenting, photographing every detail. Graves noticed a series of indentations in the soil beneath each desk. The marks matched the size and shape of a child's feet. 43 sets of prints. They stopped suddenly at the wall, where one indentation was missing. One desk had no mark beneath it at all. Her mind flashed to the photographs of Evelyn Harper. The missing child in the class photo. 43 dolls, but 44 children. The unanswered question hung over her like a weight. When Graves stepped closer to examine the room, she heard something faint, a lullaby. Low, distant, almost imperceptible. She froze. The others stopped as well, glancing around nervously. The sound was soft, melodic. Children singing. Graves turned toward the sound, heart pounding. The others insisted it was the wind or the creak of old wood. But she knew better. That lullaby had a pattern. A phrase repeated, one for each that stayed behind. No one knew where it was coming from. The team withdrew, sealing the chamber again. Graves stood alone for a moment, her flashlight trained on the door. Her breath left small clouds in the air. Somewhere below them, behind the walls of the abandoned school, Room B still held its secret. And Graves knew this was no ordinary investigation anymore. This was something she could not let go. The discovery of the hidden chamber beneath Maple Hollow Elementary changed the course of the investigation forever. Officer Helen Graves couldn't shake the image of 43 identical dolls sitting on child-sized desks, silent witnesses to a truth no one had dared speak aloud for decades. But there was one question now driving her every thought: who were these children, and why had they been left behind? Graves spent the following days poring over town archives, school records, and local newspapers. What she uncovered was both chilling and impossible to ignore. Between 1975 and 1979, Maple Hollow Elementary had quietly participated in a government-funded behavioral correction program, the details of which were buried in redacted files labeled Classroom B Project. According to the surviving documents, the program targeted children deemed non-compliant or unmanageable. 43 students were enrolled. Evelyn Harper's name appeared on the list, not as a student, but as a subject observer. The more Graves read, the more the pieces fell into place. When Officer Helen Graves returned to the site that night, she felt as though she were crossing into something forbidden. The air was thick and cold, each breath forming visible clouds. The yellow police tape had been replaced by her own cordon. No one was allowed near. This was no longer about evidence or investigation. This was about what she feared most: confronting Room B before whatever slept beneath it fully awoke. She carried only a flashlight, her recorder, and the principal's files. Each step toward the slab covering Room B felt heavier, as though the earth itself resisted her approach. Her boots crunched softly against the gravel, but beneath her, she could swear she heard faint footsteps. She paused. Silence returned, but the lullaby began again, clearer, stronger, and filled with a chorus of voices. They were not chanting. They were calling her name. Graves set her flashlight on the slab and examined the carved symbols once more. They seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, pulsing in time with her own heartbeat. Her gloved hands traced the edges of the markings. The moment her fingers touched the wood, the air shifted. A low hum filled the silence, vibrating through her bones. Somewhere below her, a door moved. Slowly. As though it was breathing. She drew her gun instinctively and signaled to the small team hidden behind her. They waited quietly. Graves placed her shoulder against the slab and pushed. The wood shifted under her force, groaning as if in protest, and then fell inward. A rush of cold air escaped from the opening beneath her feet. It smelled of earth, decay, and something faintly sweet, like a child's breath. The stairwell was darker than anything Graves had imagined. Her flashlight beam barely penetrated the gloom. She descended slowly, each step echoing against the stone walls. Behind her, the team followed silently. The lullaby grew louder. It was no longer distant. It surrounded her. Helen. 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 The voices sang softly, but the repetition was hypnotic. It drew her deeper. At the bottom of the stairwell, Graves entered the chamber again. But it was not the same room she had seen before. The shelves of dolls had multiplied. They stretched endlessly into the darkness. Their glass eyes reflected her light, hundreds upon hundreds of faces staring without blinking. The air hummed with a collective breath, and the dolls began to move, imperceptibly at first, then in small, synchronous shifts, as though acknowledging her presence. In the center of the room, a single desk stood. The diary lay open, its pages fluttering though there was no wind. Graves stepped forward, and the floor beneath her seemed to pulse. Her breath came in ragged gasps. She read Evelyn Harper's last words again: "They are waking. Room B is ready. They will not rest." From somewhere deep in the shadows came a whisper. Clear. Human. Evelyn's voice. Helen, you found us. Now you must decide. A chill ran through Graves. The dolls moved again, this time turning slowly toward her in unison. Their faces were expressionless, but their eyes glistened with something living. 43 pairs of eyes, each belonging to a child. And one more, a pair that belonged to Evelyn Harper. The lullaby swelled into a chorus of voices, rising in intensity until it became deafening. Graves felt the floor tremble beneath her boots. The air pulsed with energy, and the walls seemed to breathe around her. She realized Room B was not a room at all. It was a gateway. A threshold to something older than the school, older than the town, something that should never have been disturbed. The dolls began to step forward. Graves raised her gun, but her hands shook. The voices filled her head, "We will not be forgotten, you must join us." Helen, the chamber fell silent. The air stilled. Graves' flashlight flickered and died. In the dark, she heard one final whisper, Evelyn Harper's voice, soft but urgent, "Room B is calling you." And then everything went black. These were not just children who had gone missing. They had been taken, reclassified under the program, reassigned to something hidden from view. And Room B was their fate. Graves arranged interviews with former school staff. Many refused to talk. Others broke under the strain of memory. An elderly janitor, Walter Crane, agreed to meet her reluctantly, sitting in his small home surrounded by dusty photo albums and unopened letters. His hands trembled as he spoke. "They were just kids," he said softly, voice breaking. But, they weren't children anymore. They became something else. Something he wanted to forget. He pointed toward his chest, then shook his head. The principal, he thought it was for the greater good. Said it was discipline. But that night, oh God, we all heard them. Who? Graves asked. The children. Screaming. Singing. Crying all at once. And then, silence. The building shut down after that. They wouldn't talk about it. His eyes glistened with tears. It was Evelyn. She told us they wouldn't leave. Graves pressed him for more details. Crane recalled strange noises coming from the basement at night. Dolls being found in classrooms. Objects disappearing. Teachers being warned to keep quiet. Eventually, the principal ordered all mention of Room be erased. The students vanished. No transfers. No records. Just an empty school and whispers. The phrase kept echoing in Graves' mind, the children who never left. The thought was more than metaphor. It was literal. 43 children, 43 dolls, one missing child. Evelyn. When Graves returned to the evidence room that night, she spread the photographs of the dolls across the table. Each one was numbered. Each one had a tag with a date. She realized these dates aligned perfectly with the school's roster of the behavioral program's participants. The dolls weren't random. They were memorials. Crafted to preserve the identity of each child who had been reassigned to Room B. But the question remained, why 43? And why did Evelyn Harper disappear without explanation? The more Graves delved, the more she felt she was being drawn into something she couldn't control. The townspeople became restless. Rumors began to spread again, about Room B, about Evelyn, about children who vanished without a trace. One afternoon, Graves received a call from an elderly woman who claimed to have been a teacher at Maple Hollow Elementary in the late 1970s. Mrs. Lorne had spoken to her before, but this time her voice was urgent, almost fearful. "You need to hear this before it's too late," she said. Room B, it was never just a room. It was a ritual. A place where they kept them, and Evelyn knew. She made those dolls. She said they were their souls. Graves felt her blood run cold. "Their souls?" she repeated. "Yes," Mrs. Lorne whispered. "She said she carved them to keep them safe. To make sure we never forgot. The words haunted her. Graves reviewed the list of the missing children again. 43 names. 43 dolls. And one name missing. The thought struck her like a blow. What if Evelyn Harper herself was the 44th? That night, Graves returned to the sealed entrance of Room B. The air around the old school was still, heavy with the scent of rotten earth. She stood alone, flashlight in hand, staring at the patched concrete slab concealing the chamber. Somewhere beneath it, 43 children, or what they had become, still waited. And the lullaby began again. Soft, distant, almost unbearably close. One voice, clear among them all, whispered, "We will not be forgotten." Graves shivered. She knew this was no longer an investigation. This was a reckoning. By the 7th day of the investigation, Officer Helen Graves was no longer just chasing leads. She was chasing a voice, a whisper buried in time that seemed to follow her everywhere. The lullaby, first heard deep inside Room B, had not faded. Every night, when the station grew quiet, she swore she could hear it again. Faint, melodic, almost pleading. And always the same words, "We will not be forgotten." Graves knew she had to trace its origin. The sound was more than a coincidence. It was a message. She returned to the crime scene after hours, when the last of the excavation crews had left and the town had gone to sleep. The yellow tape flapped softly in the night wind as she stepped toward the sealed entrance to Room B. Her flashlight illuminated the cracked concrete, the rusted remnants of the old playground fence, and the earth freshly disturbed by the excavation. She crouched beside the slab and pressed her ear to the cold stone. The lullaby was faint but unmistakable now, a soft, trembling voice singing a tune she couldn't place. Her hand instinctively went to her recorder, but it failed to capture anything. When Officer Helen Graves returned to the site that night, she felt as though she were crossing into something forbidden. The air was thick and cold, each breath forming visible clouds. The yellow police tape had been replaced by her own cordon. No one was allowed near. This was no longer about evidence or investigation. This was about what she feared most, confronting Room B before whatever slept beneath it fully awoke. She carried only a flashlight, her recorder, and the principal's files. Each step toward the slab covering Room B felt heavier, as though the earth itself resisted her approach. Her boots crunched softly against the gravel, but beneath her, she could swear she heard faint footsteps. She paused. Silence returned, but the lullaby began again, clearer, stronger, and filled with a chorus of voices. They were not chanting. They were calling her name. Graves set her flashlight on the slab and examined the carved symbols once more. They seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, pulsing in time with her own heartbeat. Her gloved hands traced the edges of the markings. The moment her fingers touched the wood, the air shifted. A low hum filled the silence, vibrating through her bones. Somewhere below her, a door moved. Slowly. As though it was breathing. She drew her gun instinctively and signaled to the small team hidden behind her. They waited quietly. Graves placed her shoulder against the slab and pushed. The wood shifted under her force, groaning as if in protest, and then fell inward. A rush of cold air escaped from the opening beneath her feet. It smelled of earth, decay, and something faintly sweet, like a child's breath. The stairwell was darker than anything Graves had imagined. Her flashlight beam barely penetrated the gloom. She descended slowly, each step echoing against the stone walls. Behind her, the team followed silently. The lullaby grew louder. It was no longer distant. It surrounded her. Helen. 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 The voices sang softly, but the repetition was hypnotic. It drew her deeper. At the bottom of the stairwell, Graves entered the chamber again. But it was not the same room she had seen before. The shelves of dolls had multiplied. They stretched endlessly into the darkness. Their glass eyes reflected her light, hundreds upon hundreds of faces staring without blinking. The air hummed with a collective breath, and the dolls began to move, imperceptibly at first, then in small, synchronous shifts, as though acknowledging her presence. In the center of the room, a single desk stood. The diary lay open, its pages fluttering though there was no wind. Graves stepped forward, and the floor beneath her seemed to pulse. Her breath came in ragged gasps. She read Evelyn Harper's last words again, "They are waking. Room B is ready. They will not rest." From somewhere deep in the shadows came a whisper. Clear. Human. Evelyn's voice. "Helen, you found us. Now you must decide." A chill ran through Graves. The dolls moved again, this time turning slowly toward her in unison. Their faces were expressionless, but their eyes glistened with something living. 43 pairs of eyes, each belonging to a child. And one more, a pair that belonged to Evelyn Harper. The lullaby swelled into a chorus of voices, rising in intensity until it became deafening. Graves felt the floor tremble beneath her boots. The air pulsed with energy, and the walls seemed to breathe around her. She realized Room B was not a room at all. It was a gateway. A threshold to something older than the school, older than the town, something that should never have been disturbed. The dolls began to step forward. Graves raised her gun, but her hands shook. The voices filled her head, "We will not be forgotten, you must join us." "Helen," the chamber fell silent. The air stilled. Graves' flashlight flickered and died. In the dark, she heard one final whisper, Evelyn Harper's voice, soft but urgent, "Room B is calling you." And then everything went black. It was as if the sound existed only for her. Her heart pounded harder. The next morning, Graves convened with her forensic team. They had found more than just dolls and fragments of porcelain. Beneath the soil near the last doll's burial site, they uncovered more markings, etched into the stone foundation of the school. The symbols were small and deliberate, arranged in sequences that looked like a coded message. Graves compared them to the files she had recovered from the principal's office. Every scrap of paper with Evelyn Harper's writing contained similar patterns. The handwriting wasn't neat, it trembled and curved in unnatural ways, but the symbols matched exactly. Graves began to suspect the writing was not random. It was a language. And the lullaby was part of it. She returned to Mrs. Lorne, the retired teacher, who now spoke with more urgency than before. "Evelyn didn't just carve dolls," Mrs. Lorne said softly. "She was speaking to something. She said the dolls carried their voices, and their warnings." Graves pressed her. "Warnings about what?" Mrs. Lorne shook her head. "I don't know. But she feared it. She said the world wouldn't listen. That's why she buried them. So one day, someone would find them and hear." Later that afternoon, Graves revisited the police station's evidence room. The dolls sat in glass cases, their porcelain faces frozen in silence. She studied them one by one. On the soles of their feet, beneath the etched birth years, she noticed something she hadn't before, faint, almost invisible scratches forming letters. They weren't random, they spelled names. Names she recognized from the missing students' files. And one name stood apart. Carved more deeply, in a script that seemed desperate, Evelyn. The realization struck Graves like a blow. Evelyn Harper had not simply disappeared. She had left herself a mark. A warning. And if the lullaby was real, it was a message meant to be heard. That night, Graves returned alone to the site. The wind was sharp, carrying the scent of wet earth and something faintly sweet. She pressed her ear to the ground near the entrance of Room B. The lullaby began again. Clearer this time. Louder. Her breath quickened. It was a child's voice. Innocent, yet haunting. They will not rest. They will not be forgotten. Her flashlight flickered. The sound stopped. But when she straightened up, Graves saw something she couldn't explain. On the cracked concrete, faintly etched in dust and dirt, were words she had not seen before: "Find Roomby before they wake." Her blood ran cold. This was no longer an investigation into missing children. This was a warning. And Officer Graves knew she was running out of time. The warning etched into the concrete, "Find Roomby before they wake," burned in Officer Helen Graves' mind like a brand. She could no longer treat this as a cold case or a simple missing persons investigation. This was something alive, something ancient, and something waiting. She knew she had to find Roomby before whatever lay inside was disturbed. But the question was, who buried it, and why? Graves returned to the site at first light, the air thick with fog. The town was silent, as if it knew something had changed. Excavators had been pulled back by order of the mayor, who insisted the ground beneath the school was unstable. But Graves found a way around the restriction. She brought in a small team of private specialists, archaeologists and structural engineers who owed her favors. Together, they began the work in secrecy. The first day of excavation was slow and tense. The soil was stubborn, thick with roots and decades of compression. Every shovel of earth revealed fragments, porcelain shards, rusted clasps, faded fabric. Graves noted that the fragments matched the dolls buried outside. This wasn't random disposal. This was a deliberate concealment. Someone had hidden not just dolls, but pieces of Roomby itself. By the third day, the team broke through something hard. Not stone, but something organic, a surface that felt wrong under the spade. Graves leaned closer. It was wood. Old, rotting timber, but arranged with precision. As they cleared more earth, the shape of a sealed doorway became visible. Unlike the earlier concrete slab, this one was carved and reinforced with strange symbols, similar to those etched in Evelyn Harper's files. The symbols glimmered faintly under Graves' torchlight, like they had been carved not just for marking, but for warning. Graves touched the surface and felt a strange vibration under her fingers. A hum. Low and almost imperceptible, but definitely there. Inside, the air was heavier. Cooler. As the team pried open the doorway, a rush of stale air escaped, carrying the scent of earth, old wood, and, something sweeter, something almost human. Graves shone her light inside. The stairwell descended into darkness so absolute it seemed to swallow the beam. No one spoke. The only sound was the faint echo of that lullaby. Graves stepped forward first, her flashlight cutting through the black. The stairs were narrow, winding, each step creaking like it was alive. Somewhere below, she felt movement, subtle, deliberate, as if someone or something was waiting for her. The air grew colder with every step, so cold it seemed to seep into her bones. At the bottom, they entered a vast chamber. The walls were lined with rows upon rows of shelves, each filled with porcelain dolls. Not 43 this time. Hundreds. Dolls in every size, shape, and color, each one with a face that looked disturbingly lifelike. They wore faded uniforms, tattered dresses, even scraps of childhood clothing. Some had hair tied with ribbons, others were missing limbs. But all had the same empty, unblinking gaze. At the center of the room stood a single desk. On it lay an open book, Evelyn Harper's diary. Graves stepped closer, her breath quickening. The pages were brittle, filled with careful writing in Evelyn's small hand. Each entry spoke of voices, of promises, and of fear. But the last page made her stop cold. Written there was a single sentence: "They are waking. Room B is ready. They will not rest." A sudden noise echoed through the chamber. A faint rustle, like tiny footsteps on dust. Graves froze. The dolls, all of them, seemed to turn their heads slightly, as if aware of her presence. The lullaby swelled around her. This time louder. Clearer. Dozens of voices singing in harmony. We will not be forgotten. Graves felt a wave of dread. She backed away toward the stairs. Behind her, the air seemed to shift. Somewhere in the shadows, something moved. The words from the concrete echoed again in her mind, "Find room B before they wake." But Graves now knew, they were awake. The events in the hidden chamber haunted Officer Helen Graves long after she left Maple Hollow Elementary. The images of hundreds of porcelain dolls, their glass eyes frozen in silent watch, replayed in her mind like a nightmare she could not escape. But she knew she could not walk away. Room B was not just a mystery. It was a truth someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to bury. And Graves was determined to uncover it. Back at the station, she began piecing together the fragments of evidence, the principal's files, Evelyn Harper's diary, Mrs. Lorne's testimony, the coded symbols etched into the dolls and walls. Slowly, a horrifying narrative emerged, one the town had buried for decades. The Classroom B project had not been merely a behavioral program. It was a deliberate experiment in memory, control, and permanence. Room B was not a classroom. It was a vessel. A place where children had been transformed. Where their identities had been preserved in porcelain. Where their voices had been bound. Graves reviewed Evelyn's final diary entries again. When Officer Helen Graves returned to the site that night, she felt as though she were crossing into something forbidden. The air was thick and cold, each breath forming visible clouds. The yellow police tape had been replaced by her own cordon. No one was allowed near. This was no longer about evidence or investigation. This was about what she feared most, confronting Room B before whatever slept beneath it fully awoke. She carried only a flashlight, her recorder, and the principal's files. Each step toward the slab covering Room B felt heavier, as though the earth itself resisted her approach. Her boots crunched softly against the gravel, but beneath her, she could swear she heard faint footsteps. She paused. Silence returned, but the lullaby began again, clearer, stronger, and filled with a chorus of voices. They were not chanting. They were calling her name. Graves set her flashlight on the slab and examined the carved symbols once more. They seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, pulsing in time with her own heartbeat. Her gloved hands traced the edges of the markings. The moment her fingers touched the wood, the air shifted. A low hum filled the silence, vibrating through her bones. Somewhere below her, a door moved. Slowly. As though it was breathing. She drew her gun instinctively and signaled to the small team hidden behind her. They waited quietly. Graves placed her shoulder against the slab and pushed. The wood shifted under her force, groaning as if in protest, and then fell inward. A rush of cold air escaped from the opening beneath her feet. It smelled of earth, decay, and something faintly sweet, like a child's breath. The stairwell was darker than anything Graves had imagined. Her flashlight beam barely penetrated the gloom. She descended slowly, each step echoing against the stone walls. Behind her, the team followed silently. The lullaby grew louder. It was no longer distant. It surrounded her. Helen. 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 The voices sang softly, but the repetition was hypnotic. It drew her deeper. At the bottom of the stairwell, Graves entered the chamber again. But it was not the same room she had seen before. The shelves of dolls had multiplied. They stretched endlessly into the darkness. Their glass eyes reflected her light, hundreds upon hundreds of faces staring without blinking. The air hummed with a collective breath, and the dolls began to move, imperceptibly at first, then in small, synchronous shifts, as though acknowledging her presence. In the center of the room, a single desk stood. The diary lay open, its pages fluttering though there was no wind. Graves stepped forward, and the floor beneath her seemed to pulse. Her breath came in ragged gasps. She read Evelyn Harper's last words again, "They are waking. Room B is ready. They will not rest. From somewhere deep in the shadows came a whisper. Clear. Human. Evelyn's voice. Helen, you found us. Now you must decide. A chill ran through Graves. The dolls moved again, this time turning slowly toward her in unison. Their faces were expressionless, but their eyes glistened with something living. 43 pairs of eyes, each belonging to a child. And one more, a pair that belonged to Evelyn Harper. The lullaby swelled into a chorus of voices, rising in intensity until it became deafening. Graves felt the floor tremble beneath her boots. The air pulsed with energy, and the walls seemed to breathe around her. She realized room B was not a room at all. It was a gateway. A threshold to something older than the school, older than the town, something that should never have been disturbed. The dolls began to step forward. Graves raised her gun, but her hands shook. The voices filled her head, we will not be forgotten, you must join us. Helen, the chamber fell silent. The air stilled. Graves' flashlight flickered and died. In the dark, she heard one final whisper, Evelyn Harper's voice, soft but urgent, Room B is calling you. And then everything went black. They spoke in cryptic terms of a pact, a ritual, and a warning. Evelyn wrote that she had been chosen to protect something, the souls of the children. That Room B was not a mistake, but a promise. A promise that they would be remembered. But Evelyn had also written of fear. Of something stirring beneath the floorboards. Something that would awaken if Room B was disturbed. The more Graves read, the more she understood that the dolls were not simply memorials. They were vessels of memory. Each porcelain figure held the essence of the child it represented. Their glass eyes were not lifeless. They were mirrors of trapped souls. And Evelyn had buried them to keep them safe, to keep them silent. But she had failed to protect herself. Graves' thoughts returned to the locket found buried with the last doll. Evelyn's face, etched in miniature inside it, and the words, they won't forget us this time. Graves realized this was a warning, not just a message. Evelyn had known someone would eventually find Room B. And she had wanted them to understand the danger. The question now was, who was the they? Graves searched for an answer in the worn notebooks, the etched symbols, and the whispers of the town's oldest residents. Every lead pointed toward the principal, Warren Elridge. He had disappeared the day the school closed. No records of his whereabouts existed after that night. Graves learned from an old school board record that Elridge had been obsessed with an idea of immortality, speaking of preserving innocence and memory beyond death. Room B had been his project. Evelyn had been his unwitting apprentice. But if Room B was his creation, what had happened to him? Graves began to suspect the answer lay in the lullaby. The voices she heard beneath the school were not echoes of memory alone, they were a warning from something alive within the dolls. Something bound by Evelyn's promise. Something that could not be silenced. Graves gathered her notes and prepared to return to Room B. She knew what she would face, and she knew it was no longer a matter of curiosity or justice. It was a matter of survival. Whatever had been hidden beneath that school was not dormant. It was waking. That night, Graves returned alone. The town was silent except for the sound of the wind slipping through broken windows. She approached the sealed doorway. The air felt charged, thick with something unseen. Her flashlight flickered as she knelt beside the slab, her hand resting on the worn wood. The lullaby began again, louder this time, filling the air around her like breathing. Graves' heart pounded in her chest. The voices were no longer whispers. They were calling her name. Helen, find Room B, before it's too late. She drew her breath in sharply. The warning was no longer written. It was spoken. And Graves knew she had crossed a threshold she could never return from. When Officer Helen Graves returned to the site that night, she felt as though she were crossing into something forbidden. The air was thick and cold, each breath forming visible clouds. The yellow police tape had been replaced by her own cordon. No one was allowed near. This was no longer about evidence or investigation. This was about what she feared most, confronting Room B before whatever slept beneath it fully awoke. She carried only a flashlight, her recorder, and the principal's files. Each step toward the slab covering Room B felt heavier, as though the earth itself resisted her approach. Her boots crunched softly against the gravel, but beneath her, she could swear she heard faint footsteps. She paused. Silence returned, but the lullaby began again, clearer, stronger, and filled with a chorus of voices. They were not chanting. They were calling her name. Graves set her flashlight on the slab and examined the carved symbols once more. They seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, pulsing in time with her own heartbeat. Her gloved hands traced the edges of the markings. The moment her fingers touched the wood, the air shifted. A low hum filled the silence, vibrating through her bones. Somewhere below her, a door moved. Slowly. As though it was breathing. She drew her gun instinctively and signaled to the small team hidden behind her. They waited quietly. Graves placed her shoulder against the slab and pushed. The wood shifted under her force, groaning as if in protest, and then fell inward. A rush of cold air escaped from the opening beneath her feet. It smelled of earth, decay, and something faintly sweet, like a child's breath. The stairwell was darker than anything Graves had imagined. Her flashlight beam barely penetrated the gloom. She descended slowly, each step echoing against the stone walls. Behind her, the team followed silently. The lullaby grew louder. It was no longer distant. It surrounded her. Helen. 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 The voices sang softly, but the repetition was hypnotic. It drew her deeper. At the bottom of the stairwell, Graves entered the chamber again. But it was not the same room she had seen before. The shelves of dolls had multiplied. They stretched endlessly into the darkness. Their glass eyes reflected her light, hundreds upon hundreds of faces staring without blinking. The air hummed with a collective breath, and the dolls began to move, imperceptibly at first, then in small, synchronous shifts, as though acknowledging her presence. In the center of the room, a single desk stood. The diary lay open, its pages fluttering though there was no wind. Graves stepped forward, and the floor beneath her seemed to pulse. Her breath came in ragged gasps. She read Evelyn Harper's last words again, "They are waking. Room B is ready. They will not rest." From somewhere deep in the shadows came a whisper. Clear. Human. Evelyn's voice. "Helen, you found us. Now you must decide." A chill ran through Graves. The dolls moved again, this time turning slowly toward her in unison. Their faces were expressionless, but their eyes glistened with something living. 43 pairs of eyes, each belonging to a child. And one more, a pair that belonged to Evelyn Harper. The lullaby swelled into a chorus of voices, rising in intensity until it became deafening. Graves felt the floor tremble beneath her boots. The air pulsed with energy, and the walls seemed to breathe around her. She realized Room B was not a room at all. It was a gateway. A threshold to something older than the school, older than the town, something that should never have been disturbed. The dolls began to step forward. Graves raised her gun, but her hands shook. The voices filled her head, "We will not be forgotten, you must join us." "Helen," the chamber fell silent. The air stilled. Graves' flashlight flickered and died. In the dark, she heard one final whisper, Evelyn Harper's voice, soft but urgent, "Room B is calling you." And then everything went black. When Officer Helen Graves opened her eyes, she was no longer in the stairwell beneath Maple Hollow Elementary. The air was thick and still, a suffocating darkness pressing against her chest. Somewhere far above, muffled sounds of the world beyond seeped in, wind, distant traffic, the faint hum of life, but here, time felt broken. She was somewhere else entirely. The dolls surrounded her. Not on shelves this time, but standing in a perfect circle. Their porcelain faces reflected no fear, no warmth, only silent awareness. Their glass eyes seemed to glisten with faint inner light, and she realized they were not silent anymore. They were humming the lullaby. Slow at first, building in intensity until it filled the air with a sound that seemed to resonate inside her skull. From the center of the circle came a figure. Evelyn Harper. Her face pale and ethereal, dressed in the tattered uniform Graves had seen in the files. She stepped forward, hands folded, voice steady but chilling. "You have found us, Helen. And now you must choose. To leave is to forget. To stay is to remember." Graves' mind raced. Every instinct screamed to flee, but something rooted her in place: the weight of the files, the faces of the missing children, the warning etched in dust and concrete. She thought of the 43 dolls, each a fragment of a lost child. She thought of Evelyn's words in her diary, "Room B is a promise." Promise to whom? Graves asked, voice trembling. "To us," Evelyn said softly. "To the children who were taken. To the ones who wait. Room B is not punishment. It is preservation. And preservation requires sacrifice." The dolls shifted closer, their footsteps quiet but deliberate. Graves noticed their faces were changing, subtle at first, then unmistakable. They were morphing, becoming the children they once were. Their voices joined in the lullaby, whispering her name. "You must choose," Evelyn repeated. "Join us, and you will remember. Walk away, and you will forget everything. But they will wake, Helen. And if they wake, Room B will no longer hold them." Graves felt the pull of the circle. The air seemed to hum stronger, pulling at her bones, her mind, her very soul. She thought of the warning, "Find Room B before they wake." Now she understood. They were awake already. She looked around. 43 children. One missing. Evelyn Harper. And her. The choice was hers alone. The lullaby grew louder. The air thickened. Shadows shifted. Graves could feel the pull of Room B like a tide. She knew that if she stepped forward, she would never return. If she stepped back, she might destroy something forever. Her breath came in ragged gasps. She raised her hand, trembling. The dolls moved closer. Evelyn's voice echoed in her mind, "Choose. Helen. Choose." Graves took a deep breath. Her eyes fixed on the circle. And then she stepped forward. The chamber shuddered. The walls seemed to dissolve. The lullaby became a chorus of children's voices, singing louder, stronger, as if the world itself was bending around them. Graves felt herself pulled into the light. The last thing she heard before the darkness swallowed her was the whisper of Evelyn Harper, "Welcome to Room B." The ground above the school was still the next morning. The slab covering Room B remained in place. But if anyone stopped to listen closely, they could hear the faintest sound drifting up from below, the lullaby.